So there's a bunch of people who haven't been here yet, so I'll do a quick review. I don't have the worksheets from the previous classes, so I'm sorry about that. What we've been discussing is called the what we call the teleological argument, and basically it is an argument for God's existence from design, but it's not to be confused with the intelligent design theory. This is different than that. And a lot of times this is called the fine-tuning argument. And what that refers to is that there are aspects of our universe that seem to be fine-tuned for the existence of life, to allow the existence of life. And this is what this is referring to. And what I mean by fine-tuning and what the proponents of this argument mean by fine-tuning is not that the universe seems like someone tuned it. It just means that the margins for error to allow life are so tight. And I'm not talking about biological life like that. I'm just talking about constants in physics. What we have is like this, what we call the gravitational constant, that there is the force of gravity is such that if it's adjusted by, the slightest margin, there wouldn't even be the possibility for life to exist anywhere in the universe. So there's things like that, the attraction between like atoms and protons, that like that's called this weak force. Like that is like sort of this constant force that is just there, and it's not determined by the laws of nature. There's no laws of nature that determines what gravity is, the constant of gravity. Now, gravity affects different things differently because of their mass, but the force of gravity is always this constant. And if it was, I put up these big numbers and stuff and show that if it was changed by the slightest amount, life would not exist. And so when we say fine tuning, we were talking about these things, that even at the beginning of the universe, there seemed to be these constants and amounts of things that it just were there. And like if they weren't at the level they were at, the amount that they were at, life wouldn't be possible in the universe. I didn't go through every single one because that's not the point. It's just to sort of illustrate that there are these things here. And the argument is not arguing for fine-tuning. Fine-tuning is generally accepted across the scientific spectrum, that our universe seems so finely tuned to allow the possibility of life to even begin. So what we mean by the fine-tuning argument is like, so what is the cause of the fine-tuning? Like, why is the universe seem to be fine-tuned? And we came there right now, there are sort of three possibilities. One would be what's called physical necessity, which is the least accepted, least plausible explanation. It just means that it has to be that way. Like it's just, because life exists, it has to be that way. If you remember from my first class, I talked about necessity versus contingency. And the second option is chance. So that it just happened to be that way by chance. And sort of the point of a lot of the numbers I was showing is that it is it's basically mathematically, statistically impossible for it to happen by chance. I mean, you can say, yes, it could be chance. And then the third would be then design. Was it designed this way? And so the question we're asking is, any one of these choices better than any other one? And I'm sort of saying, like, yes, the design seems the most probable. I'm not saying that it's absolutely this case and it's absolutely not chance, but you are most reasonable in thinking that it's design over the other ones. That's sort of what the point of the argument is. That's a quick overview. If you're actually new this week, it spares you a lot of math that we sort of went into and a lot of stuff that was probably over a lot of people's heads. So last week we talked about physical necessity and chance. This week I'm going to talk about design. So I sort of went over why both physical necessity and chance seem very improbable. Chance is basically because of the near statistical impossibility for this to happen, from chance. And I said that the big push now in a lot of circles is what's called the many worlds hypothesis. It's that our universe is part of this greater multiverse, and there's sort of this infinite number of universes, and so that increases the likelihood that this type of universe would happen. And I sort of talked about the issues with that. Is that one, there is actually no scientific evidence for that. That is like a faith-based idea, so these atheists sort of come up with this based on faith. Like it might be possible, it's possible and it might be there, but we don't have actual scientific evidence. So when they talk about it, They're just sort of coming up with a solution for this problem of the fine tuning, this problem of design. So that leaves us with, design as our third option, which is we're going to talk about. Now, just because like something is very, very unlikely or highly improbable, like that we're here by chance, it doesn't mean that like it's not the best option. Sometimes the only options you have are very improbable options. So at the time, you have to sort of accept one of those. So we shouldn't just accept design based on, well, these other things seem unlikely. So, there are many instances where belief in an improbable explanation of something is like justified and is the best choice. I'll give an example of this, like why you might believe chance is the best choice for something. Imagine like Dave is playing baseball. Dave's always my go-to example, and he comes up to bat. I know Dave was a basketball player, not a baseball player, but so he comes up to bat, gets thrown some heaters, swings and misses a couple times, but he's determined not to strike out. So the third pitch comes at him, and he swings and hits, and it's just like a shot, home run over the fence. Before the ball comes down, it hits pigeon. Just like takes out a pigeon. Now, what's the best explanation? Like now, is it better to say that the pigeon was just hit by chance, or do we say that the best explanation is Dave was actually aiming to hit the pigeon? No, in that case, it's chance. Like chance is the better explanation. It'd actually be much more improbable for him to sort of aim and hit a pigeon with like a swing at a baseball. You jump in the gun. Now imagine the same scenario where Dave is at home plate with his gun. And then he has his rifle and he pulls it up and he shoots and a pigeon drops from the sky. Now, do we then say that happened by chance? Did he just happen to pull up his gun and shoot and the pigeon? Or is it more likely that he took aim at the pigeon and shot the pigeon down? So in one sense, the better explanation is that, Dave sort of intended to shoot the pigeon. In the other sense, it is more likely that it was chance. So again, sometimes it's not always like one or the other. Sometimes chance is the best explanation for something. Or the improbable is the best, like we say, oh man, what's there been a coincidence? Or like blind luck, I'm not getting into the laws of physics and how something like this could happen. It's just, that's the best explanation. Like it just happened to be so that a pigeon was flying by as Dave hit that ball and it just happened. So in the second example I gave, the improbable explanation of Dave just sort of shooting from the hip, which he does with his mouth, is not what took the bird down. I'm really picking on Dave tonight. And I'm calling him Dave, and he likes to be called David, so I'm really digging into him. So when we're looking at this the explanation for fine-tuning, we sort of have to ask ourselves this question. Is design the more plausible explanation, or is the less likely, improbable explanation the better one? Now, if it's equally probable, then both people, like people that believe in chance or people that believe in design, are sort of on the same level. One doesn't hold advantage over the other. But if it seems much more probable, then believing that the fine-tuning of the universe is best explained by chance is actually a very reasonable stance to take. You are not unreasonable for believing that, even though people might call you unreasonable. So that's sort of the point we're kind of making, So basically, the fine-tuning of the universe appears to be designed. This is actually secular and atheistic science say this, that it has the appearance of being designed, that it is so incredibly unlikely that all these things would happen to fit in place that it has the appearance of design. So they'll say like, okay, the universe appears to be designed. So a big objection to this, the big detraction from this is they'll often point that, well, okay, the universe is designed, but then where did the designer come from? Who designed the designer? Which in one sense is, not even addressing the question. It's sort of pushing it back. They don't want to answer the one question, so they push it back. This is a common thing that people do. Even we do it when we try to sort of change the subject. It's not a change of the subject, but So this is actually, if you don't know who Richard Dawkins is, he's an evolutionary biologist, prominent atheist speaker. You can see a lot of his videos on YouTube. He got sort of really big in 1996 when he wrote his book called The God Delusion. And he calls this question, who designed the designer, like his central argument in this book. Like he calls it, he's the one who says that this book is basically this argument is the central theme of this book. And so I wrote out his argument, which you can find in his book. And that's the handout for today.
He believes in design.
No, he's an atheist.
I know who he is, but you're bringing him into this because you're trying to show us that he does not believe in design. You're bringing him into this because you believe he does not believe in design.
Yeah, he basically illustrates the biggest objection to design, right now. And so that's what this is. This is his argument laid out in his book, The God Delusion. And as I said, the general consensus amongst, the leading scientists of the day say that it is true that the fine-tuning of the universe appears to be intentionally designed. That's what they'll say. But now the explanation is, why is that? And so detractors of design will say, like, well, the problem is, who designed the designer? That's the big thing. Like, if it's designed, then where did the designer come from? Where did God come from? And as I said, that question isn't actually part of this argument. We're not trying to explain, the existence of God. We're just sort of explaining fine-tuning, and design seems to be the best explanation. So let me just read his argument. It's a lot of steps. If you've been paying attention at all in any of these classes, maybe you'll have some things to say when I'm done reading it. So here it is. This is in his book, The God Delusion. I think you can find it on page 157 of the paperback, but I'm not sure. I didn't write that down. So number one, and again, this is laid out like how I've laid out arguments before, the philosophical format. One of the greatest challenges to the human intellect has been to explain how the complex, improbable appearance of design in the universe arises. So as he says, like, there is an appearance of design there. He acknowledges it. He doesn't try to deny that fact. The natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. The temptation is a false one because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. That's his big premise of this argument. Like I said, that's sort of the point of his book. Now, number four, the most ingenious and powerful explanation of biological complexity is Darwinian evolution by natural selection. So basically what he's saying is evolution has sort of given us a scientific explanation for biological complexity. So then go to number five, he's saying we don't have an equivalent explanation for physics. Like, these fine-tuning things are sort of the complexity of physics. He's saying that science hasn't given us an explanation of where this fine-tuning comes from. Number six, we should not give up hope of a better explanation arising in physics, something as powerful as Darwinianism is for biology. Therefore, God almost certainly does not exist. So, can anybody sort of, before even talking about some of the premises he's saying, see a problem in this argument? You need the microphone. Just hold the button.
The last one, the conclusion, he says almost certainly God doesn't exist. So he's not even really certain of his own thoughts on this?
I mean, this is how he has it worded. This is how he wrote it out. I think he's sort of concluding that, like how just I said, that the fine-tuning argument says that belief in God belief in a designer is the more reasonable, but it's not the absolute conclusion we get from the argument. I think he's maybe just saying that. Try to give him the benefit that he's saying that it's, you're more reasonable to believe that God doesn't exist than to believe that he does exist. I think maybe that's what he's sort of saying there. have the mic. Again, my question is more to see if you guys pick up on, not to talk about the content necessarily of each premise, but if you can see a problem in this argument.
There's just one word in number one where it says improbable appearance of design in the universe arises. The word improbable, it's not the word impossibility. When you're alluding to Dave hitting a turkey or a pigeon?
Pigeon?
A pigeon. Well, if Dave was at bat for 2 million years, the chances of him hitting a pigeon rise dramatically, and when it happens, the chances are 100% because it happened.
Yeah,
So-
but when we're talking about chance and probability, we're talking about, even though, yes, once it happened, it's 100%, but you can still calculate the probability of it happening, and that's sort of what we're talking about.
Right. Well, the same thing to use our universe as it exists now. Perhaps there were 1,000 that tried to exist, but they didn't have that perfect balance of gravitational, a weak, strong force, electromagnetism. But then eventually one did hit that fine tuning. So the chances of our universe being created was 100%.
Well, that's not chance. That's not what we're talking about. And no, it is, but like it is 100% true that our universe is here, that it exists. So it's like what we're talking about is an explanation for why it happened. And I'm not sort of, like I say, I'm not saying the chance is impossible. I'm not, you can accept chance as the reason our universe is here. I'm just saying you are dealing with an incredibly low probability. Like, so to say that like, oh, we're just here by chance, that's fine. But as I explained, what I was explaining last week is that it is much more probable that you're just a brain and all this is an illusion. Like, it's more likely that that's the case than that any of this actually exists if you want to accept chance as the cause.
But not impossible, just improbable.
Yeah, it's just improbable. Again, depending on who you talk to.
Ben, could you repeat your question?
My question is more, does anyone sort of see a problem with this argument?
I see in number 6, I don't know if it's a problem, but it sounds like he's editorializing when he says we should not give up the hope of a better explanation arising in physics. It sounds like he's...
I'll get to that. Basically what, if you were here the first class, this argument is actually invalid. It's philosophically invalid. It's not logical. Like, that's basically what I was looking for. Like, so before we even discuss the details, what that means is the conclusion does not follow from the premises. Like, based on these 6 premises, you don't get that conclusion. So like we'll grant all the truth. We'll say every one of these premises is true. If you give them that they're all true, like that conclusion doesn't follow. Like you don't get that conclusion from these premises. At best, I think the conclusion you would get from this argument is that one should not infer God's existence based on the appearance of design. Like, so we shouldn't use the appearance of design to then infer God's existence if the premises were all true. But that conclusion is wildly different than his conclusion. That conclusion still could lead to God existing. Like that still doesn't disprove God's existence. It might just mean that the design argument isn't the best argument for God's existence. I think Mark has a question.
Ben, number 4, Darwin's evolution, he seems to use that as something that's automatic, and to me that is a very weak place to place his...
You're again, since you're new, for the sake of the fine-tuning argument, I'm granting evolution. We'll give evolution for the sake of this argument, because even if the fine-tuning at the beginning of the universe is off, like you can't even get a universe that would allow for evolution to even start. That's sort of what this is talking. This sort of skirts the evolution question. Evolution is coming in this class, but it's going to be at the end. But number 4, I'll give him number 4. I have problems with other ones. So this this is sort of the point of this argument, and why I presented it is that you don't even need to engage in the evolution debate. You can just say that, if just for your benefit, this is if the gravitational constant was off by 10 to the 100, so that number is 10 with 100 zeros off of it after it. So imagine 100 zeros, 1%. That's that number. If gravity was off by that much, like the universe, it would be impossible to support life. And I don't mean like human life, like any life. Like you couldn't even, a planet couldn't even form where evolution could even start. Yeah, that's the universe would either expand too much or implode in on itself. So this is even to get to the point where evolution could even begin to start happening. So
number 2 says the natural temptation. So to me, that's where the problem arises, is he's assuming that if you want to believe that God designed the universe, you've been tempted to believe that. He's like, it's almost like he's saying it's just a weakness right from the very beginning, that you're being tempted to believe in God. Instead of logically looking at the situation, that's a natural temptation.
yeah, I mean, I think that it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's like use your powers of observation. Like if we were to get to Mars and we find this like big sort of old rusted out mechanical machine, we would assume that some intelligence put it there. And so I wouldn't say that's like a misplaced natural temptation to sort of assume that, So he's saying like the appearance of design, like he's right that it doesn't always mean that something was designed, but I don't think it's a bad temptation to sort of think that way. But as I said, for now, I just want to state that like the very argument itself and is invalid. Like
To use the word temptation to me means that you already have a preset, an idea in your head. Anybody doesn't agree with you, then you're being tempted.
Yeah, I mean, before like we get too far off on these premises, which we'll talk about, I just want to like just focus on this right now, and that his argument is invalid. And as I said, the best I would change the conclusion to, therefore, like one should not infer, we'll say designer or God, based on the appearance of design. And so that's what the conclusion of his argument should be, based on his premises. And that I'm not arguing about the premises right now. We'll get that towards the end of class. But given the truth, we'll just give him the truth of all 6 of these premises. The conclusion should be this. I think this is the best that it should be. It shouldn't be, therefore, God almost certainly does not exist. So again, if you read all 6 of these things, like what would follow, I think, would be this. So he makes a big logical leap, and that makes the argument invalid. And sort of, this is the problem, and this is sort of what I talked about, is that some of these discussions, why philosophy is important. Dawkins is not a philosopher, and he doesn't understand logic. He's a biologist. So he tries to make a philosophical argument, but he fails. Like he makes an invalid argument. And he brings a lot of his own sort of, preconceptions and notions and puts them in argumentative form when, like, that's what he shouldn't do. And sort of that's, if he was in a philosophical debate, they would just, they could just say, oh, that's an invalid argument. This discussion's over. I mean, we're going to talk more about his points. Like, let's give him some of his points. And the reason I bring this up is because, like I said, this is the predominant response to the fine-tuning argument right now. Let me just get my spot back real quick, because, yeah, I got derailed a little bit. We started talking about stuff I didn't want to talk about yet. Again, so like I said, the point, like you can reject the design argument, but that doesn't then doesn't mean God exists. Like I said, the best is that, okay, maybe it's not the best argument for God, but like I said, at the beginning of the year, I presented 4 other arguments that we could use. So this sort of, I think, just the teleological argument combined with those other arguments, just sort of strengthens the case. And the reason I'm picking on Dawkins is because I don't really like him. I mean, no, there's plenty of atheists like I read and admire, and I could recommend them to you. But like Dawkins is someone who he doesn't read the opposing literature. He's sort of narrow-minded in his view. He's sort of like a lot of what I think a lot of Christians and what a lot of Christians get criticized is he's narrow-minded. He's sort of dogmatic and narrow-minded. He refuses to debate people on the opposite side, where someone like Sam Harris, who's another atheist, he debates like Christian philosophers. Like he'll go and debate, and Dawkins won't. He says they're not worthy of debate. That's what he'll say about Christian scientists and philosophers. And so someone like that, like, yeah, I'm going to pick on this guy because he refuses to enter the discussion. So the argument's invalid, but we're going to like examine the argument even more, like I think some people started to do, because I think some of the premises are false as well. So as I said in the beginning, like you can disprove an argument if it's either invalid or one of the premises you prove to be false. So I think some of these premises are false. We're going to start with, I mean, maybe not even false, just sort of bad. They're just bad. It's just like bad arguments. Like 5 and 6, I think, like shouldn't even be in a philosophical argument.
Yeah, I don't understand the point of 5. What is he trying to say with that?
Well, I mean, basically what he is saying is that, look, for a long time, we thought like that the biodiversity we saw in the world was just like, evidence of, like God just created all these species. But then, we have this prevailing scientific theory of evolution, and now that is like a pretty good explanation for biodiversity. So he's saying like, for a long time we didn't know that, now we know that. So one day physics will do the same thing. So let's just have faith. So to me, that's what 5 and 6 are. That, like he even said, we should not give up hope for a better explanation.
Doesn't having faith then kind of the opposite argument that he's trying to make?
Yeah.
Having faith.
Yeah, and that's he's basically put himself on the same. I mean, yeah, that he's sort of objecting to, like, and that was sort of I think the point of the fine-tuning argument for me is that, there is faith. Whatever you believe, whatever someone believes, there is a big leap of faith. And as I said, that I gave these 3 options for fine-tuning, like, yes, chance is a possible option, but it takes a big leap of faith if you want to accept chance as the reason for the fine-tuning of the universe. I gave the lottery ball example to sort of illustrate what it would be like, and that didn't even come close. You once heard that like if you put 1,000 monkeys on 1,000 typewriters, eventually they would write like a Shakespearean play. Given an infinite amount of time. Like this is like so much more. Like you would need like trillions of monkeys on trillions of typewriters, and it still like wouldn't happen. Like that's basically what these. And Bill, I understand your point. Like, we're here, so somehow it happened. And that's sort of what we're trying to get at, And that's why I'm saying it is reasonable to then assume there is some kind of purpose or some kind of design because it is so improbable. Like, we're not being unreasonable.
So how do you then approach an argument if we do end up finding life on another planet?
I actually think that strength, because this isn't about life on Earth. This is just life in the universe, the possibility of life in the universe. We already live in a universe where life is possible. We know that. And I actually think because life is so improbable, even like evolutionary biologists will tell you life is incredibly improbable. I think if we find intelligent life, that actually increases arguments for God's existence because it's so improbable. You probably haven't heard that tack before, but I think Christianity, and not even Christianity, but belief in God in general, like says nothing about life on other planets. I think in one sense it enhances that. And I don't want to get into discussions about theologically what that means, but at the end of the class we can talk about that if we end early. If people want to ask questions about that, because I'll talk about it, just not right now. So again, I want to go over some of question in the back.
Ben, the term "the appearance of design," is that what you're saying? Is that basically accepted amongst the scientific community?
Yeah, like I said, the
Wow.
fine tuning of the fine tuning in the universe of physics is accepted. The appearance of design is accepted. There's a couple of philosophers and scientists, and I'm talking in like these are astrophysics,
Right.
astrophysicists, astronomers, physicists. They accept, like I said, the fine tuning is a given. The fact that these it's basically statistically impossible that our universe would be the way it is. So this is about the explanation for why it's the way it is.
That's news to me because I never would have thought that they would even acknowledge the appearance of a design.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Dawkins is even he acknowledges that the universe appears to be designed.
An appearance is not a fact, though.
No, and we're not talking about facts. Okay, so again, I talked about 5 and 6 and how like this isn't even like philosophical points he's making. This is like sort of like the faith of naturalism, I call it. You know, the god of atheism. This sort of faith that one day like there'll be an explanation, or that the multiverse has sort of also been called the god of atheism. And as I said, even if there is this multiverse that is filled with an infinite number of universes, then that is going to be governed by laws. And then what if that turns out to be fine-tuned? You know, where did the fine-tuning for the multiverse come from? You know, and you may have heard of what's called like superstring theory or string theory, and sort of this theory that's, you know, it is nowhere nearly as accepted as the Big Bang theory, but it's this theory that could point to there being more than one universe, but it doesn't give evidence. It's just if you lay out the mathematics of string theory, it's like, okay, there's actually a possibility of all these different universes. But string theory itself must be very fine-tuned. It needs a specific number of dimensions to work. And so like that, when that first started to be developed, they were like, oh, here it is, we've solved it. And then as they sort of expanded the theory more, they realized, oh, okay. And that, you know, there's this, I can't think of his name, but there's this famous mathematician, Tommy talked about him on Sunday, who was a big founder of string theory. And now that led him, he's the one who calls God a mathematician. He was like, mathematics led me to believe in God. So I'm just trying to say that you're not on shaky ground scientifically if you believe what you believe in Christianity. Okay, so 5 and 6 appear weird, but like let's go to the central, what he says, the central argument of his book, in that the problem with thinking that the universe was designed is then who designed the designer. That's his big, if you read The God Delusion, he'll say that is the big argument of his book. So I see like two problems with this, two problems with the step 3 that he has. And let me read it again. The temptation is a false one because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. So I have two problems with this premise, and I'm going to talk a little bit about his book more too and what he says while I explain it. But he's basically saying in this, in order to recognize an explanation as the best explanation, you then must have an explanation of that explanation. This is like a false claim. I mean, and science wouldn't operate under this assumption. It's actually a very elementary point in the philosophy of science. You know, if you're taking the philosophy of science is like basically how do you approach science? What's the point of science? All that stuff. And they're basically like, this is a rejection of that. Let me give you some examples. Like, let's say there's an archaeologist somewhere in an undiscovered place, and he's, you know, just digging in the dirt. You know, there doesn't seem to be any signs of life anywhere. He's just digging in the dirt in a jungle, never seemed to be habitat. And he suddenly comes across like some arrowheads, some axes, some tools. He would then be safe to assume that the explanation for these things being here was that there was some kind of civilization there at some point. He then doesn't have to have an explanation of how that civilization was there or where it came from to be safe in assuming that it was caused by some sort of civilization. Again, I use the argument on Mars, like if a bunch of astronauts went to the dark side of the moon and found like what looked like to be some kind of spaceship, they would be safe in assuming that someone that was there before them or some kind of life, intelligent life that was able to manufacture a spaceship was there. You know, they don't need then an explanation of what kind of intelligence created that to be safe in that assumption. Even going back like before Christ, you can go back. I think this was sort of figured out around 600 BC in the terms of like ancient farmers were able to infer that their crops were better when they got more rain and more sunlight. They did not have any understanding of weather. They didn't know where rain come from. They didn't have any explanation of the sun, yet their explanation of why their crops were better certain years was still correct. And they didn't need an explanation of those things to then have that be a valid explanation. This is actually what's called an infinite regress, if you think about it, because anytime you explain the explanation, then that explanation needs another explanation, and it goes back ad infinitum. And actually, science would sort of collapse because we couldn't then take anything as being true unless we had all the infinite number of explanations to get to the current explanation of why something exists. So that's one problem I have with 3. Like, just because the best evidence for the universe is that it seems to be that it's designed, we don't have to have an explanation of the designer to infer that. You know, that is a different discussion. It could be a different argument. You know, like I said, we've had sort of similar arguments about that. We're just looking at what is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. Another thing that I want to talk about with step 3 is, and Dawkins is very big on what he calls the sort of simplicity, like the in science, you're always looking for the simplest solution, the simplest explanation. And in one sense, it's a good thing to have, but he very much overweights simplicity. Like to him, simplicity reigns supreme. Like an explanation has to be, whatever the simplest explanation is, it's the best explanation. So, you know, he states that when you have the universe is so incredibly complex, and then the designer of the universe must be equally complex. So there is no really explanatory advance because there is no sort of simple solution to then explain this more complex thing. So again, he puts the most important aspect of sort of the designer on its simplicity, and he says like God would be way too complex, you know, so it doesn't fit. Again, this is a very evolutionary biologist sort of way of thinking. However, and I said simplicity is a good thing to have, but there are many other factors involved in an explanation than simplicity, you know, like what they call explanatory power and explanatory scope, et cetera, like do things actually, like does one explanation explain more things or less things? You want the one that explains more things than less things. So in simplicity, like even though it's important, is not like the most important. You know, go back to the Middle Ages where we thought the Earth was the center of the universe and the Earth didn't move and everything sort of revolved around us. Much simpler explanation than that we're in this weird gravitational dance and there's black holes and dark matter and all this gravity going on. But it's not right, like even though it's simple, you know. So you're sort of, you know, simplicity weighs in. If, you know, he sort of confuses what's called Occam's razor, which is not about simplicity. It's like you don't add unnecessary causes to something happening, you know. That's what Occam razor says. Like you don't need to keep adding on things when one thing is good enough, you know. So he sort of gets that confused. But again, using his own sort of view and logic about how important simplicity is, like he fails to recognize what we mean by God. And God is actually much simpler than a multiverse. I mean, God, as we've talked about before in his attributes, God doesn't have a body. Like God doesn't have this physical structure. God in essence is like a mind or like a spirit, you know. He's misunderstanding what I would call God's thoughts. Maybe God's thoughts are infinitely complex, but those aren't God. God isn't a thing in a sense. He is, but he isn't. So in one sense, like God fits his simplicity criterion. Like God is a very simple thing to then create this sort of very complex universe. Question in the back. Yeah, I mean, God names himself as I am, and God is just the simple act of, God could be defined as the simple act of just being. So again, this, I think even though I think his idea that simplicity is most important is wrong, I think God fits that better than what he thinks is the explanation of this big grand multiverse, which would be infinitely more complex than a universe the size of ours. Imagine that ad infinitum. Like, that's an incredibly complex thing. So again, I think the point number 3, his essential argument sort of fails on multiple accounts. So I'm going to read this. This is a quote from William Craig, and this is about point 3. He says, "So this point he makes fails on multiple accounts. It is not true that simplicity is the most important." Oh man, I can't read my own writing. Well, let me start again. "So this point he makes fails on multiple accounts. It is not true that simplicity is the most important factor in assessing explanations. And moreover, the explanation of a divine mind is much more simple than a complete and varied infinite multiverse." So, in conclusion for me, as I said, the fine-tuning of the universe is almost a scientific fact. And actually, even if these major advances in science are made, like the whole world of physics changes or the whole world of biology changes, and there's this new theory that revolutionizes everything, the constant of gravity is still going to be there. Like the small and weak force between atoms, the level of entropy, like these things they're not laws that are going to change. They're not theories that are going to change. They're just these things in the universe. And so they are in the science community, like, considered scientific fact. So like I said, fine tuning the appearance of design is sort of a recognized thing. So as I said, this is more the discussion of what is the best explanation for why the universe appears to be fine-tuned, and I think it is a designer. So that's the end of this section of the class. But we'll take some questions or comments, or I'm fine to stop talking. So, in the back.
It's really not much of a question, Ben, but I know last week you mentioned there was gravity, electromagnetism.
Well, you have the 4 forces in the universe. There's gravity, electromagnetism, and the small and weak force. The strong and weak force. So those are a little harder to grasp, but they're the forces that hold atoms together. So, you have a nucleus, protons and electrons, and basically the electrons are attracted to the nucleus. And, if you add electrons, you change the element. So basically, this is what the foundation of all matter is made up of. So there's forces that work on a tiny level that hold these things together or separate them apart.
So the strong and weak forces that you were talking about,
They're constants as well.
in relation to atoms and
Just the force itself. Like, if the force itself is a constant, like, as I said, physics is a lot of mathematics. So when they sort of put these things down in formula form, they notice that there's these constants that never change. Like, one, like I said, is gravity. You have electromagnetism. Like, think of pi. Like, pi is always the same. We just have this number pi. These are things. Like, so when they're calculating some kind of physics equation, they'll just have a number they plug in for gravity. Like, oh, there's the constant of gravity. It's always the same. So that's what these things are.
so basically it's those 4.
There's a lot more than that. But I just, I don't want to get, there's a lot more. There's about, I think, 10 to 20 different constants exist in the universe. And then there's what they call arbitrary amounts. Like, there was just a certain amount of stuff that was just there. Like, there's a certain amount of matter that was just there at the beginning of the universe. And it's just there. Like, there's no law of nature that explains why there's X amount of matter in the universe. Matter and energy. Don't go on the internet. Hold the mic up. Is it turned on?
Did you turn it off? Okay. And I was watching a couple videos on the fine tuning, but I noticed also that there were some videos that were saying that fine tuning can really be explained. So I didn't get a chance to look at them, but is there some validity to that? Have you seen anything like
Well,
that?
what they're probably referring to is called this many worlds hypothesis. And then this gets talked about like it's a scientific like fact. Like they've basically thrown it out there like it is it's actually a thing. Like I said, they talk about the explanation is this multiverse, and there's parallel universes, and then we're just one of many parallel universes and stuff. And like I said, it might be possible that might be the case, but there actually isn't scientific evidence of this yet. Yeah, they're also this big theory now that we're in a simulation. They're saying that none of this is real. And you can, it's sort of like conspiracy theorists. Like you just throw something out there and you're like, oh, prove me wrong, when they've presented no positive evidence for them being right to begin with, Okay, so we're going to, Bill.
Do you think Dawkins, I think you said he's not really a philosopher.
No, he is not. He's a biologist.
He sounds like someone who has an axe to grind.
Yes, he has a very big axe to grind.
Have you ever read, does he have a biography?
No, but he's got a number of books. And also, like you said, I think he also is like he wrote his book, and there's there's always the question of money. His books draw a lot of attention on the internet. He gets a lot of money. I mean, it is a simple concept, but his new, a couple years ago he was at speaking at a forum, and he basically said the new strategy that atheists should take is just don't even engage in conversation, just mock. Just mock people. Yeah. He said that so like again, he's a very smart man. He's a chair at Oxford, but I think he's just allowed this bitterness or this chip on his shoulder. Like to say, like what kind of scientist says you don't even talk to someone, you just mock them?
I've heard him on the radio.
Yeah.
With interviews and stuff.
Yeah, back in like about 10, 12 years ago, he used to do a lot of good interviews, and he's just, I think, we live in a culture, too, that think like the more outrageous you are, the more attention you get. So I think he's sort of playing into that, too. So, no, that's Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking. I'm not talking about Stephen Hawking. I'm talking about Richard Dawkins. Stephen Hawking is actually agnostic. So, agnostic. Yeah. All right, so actually before we end, so next week we're going to start a different thing, not a totally different. We're going to get into the biblical doctrine of creation. So that's going to be next, and then that will lead into our discussion of creation and evolution. Thanks.